Martine Leavitt is the author of young adult novels, including My Book of Life by Angel, a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and winner of the CLA Young Adult Book of the Year Award. Among this book award honor, Martine's other books have also garnered attention and acclaim. Katera and Lord Death was a National Book Award finalist, Tom Finder was a winner of the Mr. Christie's Book Award, and Heck Superhero was a Governor General's Award finalist. Martine's most recent novel, Calvin, has also been shortlisted for the Governor General's Award of Canada, which should be noted is the biggest literary award in Canada. Booklist reviews this book with praise, saying, Leavitt delivers an imaginative exploration of mental illness, examining what's real and what's true in this magical world. Martine's novels have been published all around the world, including in Japan, Korea, Denmark, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, and the Netherlands. She is usually found teaching at the Vermont College of Fine Arts, but is currently teaching a YA fiction workshop here at BYU. Please join me in welcoming Martine Leavitt.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. So I've been here in Utah for a little over 6 weeks now, and I've discovered a few things about Utah. First of all, I've learned that Canadians are not, in fact, the most polite people on earth. And neither is Disneyland the happiest place on earth. It's all happening right here in Provo. Everyone has been incredibly kind. I'd like to especially thank the faculty have just been so lovely to me, welcoming, and my talented students who are the reason I'm here, and you're all worth it. I will be reading from my work in progress, which is a young adult historical novel, which I thought was about 3/4 done until I figured out some very important things were not right. I never read from my published work for a couple of reasons. One is because it's a gesture of solidarity with my students whom I force read their raw, unedited work in front of everybody. Also because it's devastating to read something wrong in something that's already been published and you know you can't change it. At least reading this work in progress, I know I can slash and burn when I'm done. It does come with some risks. I recently noticed that all of the main characters in my book's names started with the letter R. Even some of their last names started with the letter R. So I changed that, but only too late did I notice that both scenes I'm going to read from end at the dinner table. So that was a little sad to realize that, but it was, like I said, too late, and I hope maybe it might mean something. Not sure what. So I'll start with an author's note that may or may not end up in the book. Then I'll read chapter 1, and then I will read a chapter that comes quite a bit later in the book. So the author's note. On June 1st, 1887, Charles Oracard came by wagon with his own and 9 other families from Utah to the Dominion of Canada, following the Whoop-Up Trail connecting Fort Benton in Montana and Fort Macleod in what is now southern Alberta. The Whoop-Up Trail was so called because the hardships of the trail made some want to comfort themselves with alcohol upon reaching the St. Mary's River. By the time these saints had crossed Immigration Gap, they had traveled twice as many miles as that of Moses leading the children of Israel. Virtually all the land in this part of the Dominion had been leased in vast amounts by the big ranching outfits owned by wealthy Easterners, Cochrane, Bar U, and Oxley. But the pioneers found an expired lease on Lee's Creek, and they erected their tents and started plowing a communal garden. The Cochrane ranchers were not happy about that. The first person to erect a log house on Lee's Creek was one Thomas Rowell Leavitt, who was my husband's great-grandfather. He wrote a brief personal history before he died, and that became a family tradition. Eventually, these short histories were collected and gathered into a hardbound volume. Their real-life stories have inspired my fictional story, and their pioneer life is the real garden into which I've placed my imaginary frogs, which are 3 families of my own invention. Excuse me, I'm finding that this microphone is right exactly where I want to read. Okay, chapter 1. She had heard her father and others call their new home God's country often enough that she wasn't as surprised as she might have been to come upon him one evening, sitting on a large rock overlooking Buffalo Flats. He was dressed in his work clothes, but you knew God when you saw him. A long spur swooped over him as if everything were usual. Insects lighted on him and flew away as if they hadn't just landed on God. But the wind and late-day sun clung to him and hung threads of light in his hair, and it was God. He saw her and smiled and said, "Rebecca." She sat beside him on the rock and gazed at the Rockies, which swept straight up out of the prairie without any foothills to interfere. The sun perched on the peak of Sofa Mountain like a burning like a candlewick, its light filling the valley like new honey, golding up every solid thing, cows, cabins, barns, barrels. The land looked less lonesome this way, but she loved it in all its ways, its winds and weathers, its rocky bones, the long-limbed prairie that stretched one's soul out of shape to see its distances, and then the Rocky Mountains, a place for prairie-weary eyes to go. A lightning storm over Old Chief flashed, followed by long, soft threads of thunder. Light and water fell straight as pins onto the mountains. "Our cows," she said, gesturing to her father's herd down the flats. He nodded with interest. It occurred to her then that he would know cows, having made them in the first place. But she wondered if he knew that these were pilgrim cows, undesigned for the privations of the West. In winter they were driven by blizzards into drifts and over banks and splayed themselves on glares of ice. In summer they were tormented by heat and flies and broke their legs in gopher holes. They died birthing their calves as if they were delicate ladies. There was nothing buffalo about them, for they were bred to be fat and tame. Still, though beeves and character were all that could grow on land like this. A land like this, Father said, could make a man give up his life to it and not be sorry. And a girl too, she thought. Father says even the Queen of England doesn't have what we have, she said, and then wondered if that sounded prideful. Humbly, she added, Mother says the Queen wouldn't want it because it's too cold. I don't mind the cold, she added, so he wouldn't feel she was being critical of his handiwork. And besides, it was true. Already she'd felt her blood braving up to the cold, changing its recipe so she'd be able to bear it. The book of Hebrews said it was a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God, but sitting beside him on a rock was a comfortable thing. She could see now Abraham being cheeky enough to dicker with God over a few good souls in Sodom, or Isaac challenging to a wrestling match, or Gideon asking for a sign, or Samson being naughty in general. You just felt he'd like you anyway. Good job, sir, she said, gazing over the flats. The honey light in the valley deepened. It might have been a long time or a short time that they sat together, but suddenly she recalled her mother's admonition not to be long on her wander. She hesitated and then decided it would go harder on her to displease Mother than to dismiss herself from the company of deity. So she said, Guess I'll go home now. She slid from the rock and stood. "Guess I will too," he said, but it was so kindly said it might have been, "I wish it could be longer." She had gone only a few steps down the bluff when the sun slipped behind the mountains, instantly snuffing out the light and filling the flats with shadow. A wolf howled. She was filled with a yearning then to ask him something she couldn't quite fit into a sentence, something about shadows and the strangeness of sleep. But when she turned back, he was gone. She walked home then, through the shadows, the taste of honey light still in her throat. She opened the door and said, in her everyday voice, as if her heart hadn't landed on God, "I'm home." Rebecca came to her parents a daughter after 6 sons. 3 of her brothers lived with her in Buffalo Flats, Ammon, Gideon, and Aaron. The oldest brother, William, still worked in the mines in England, having been unconverted by what father considered the restored gospel. Another brother, Jared, had stayed in Utah, for his wife would not leave her fruit trees. And then Samuel, who was in Iowa, where he had died and been buried on the way west. Samuel was as real to her as the brothers she lived with every day. She understood that he was always busy preventing little family accidents, showing up at Christmas and so on to bring an added measure of happiness and sorrow. She was envious of him sometimes, seeing as he had no work to do but save the day every so often and be there for holidays. When Rebecca was a baby, and a tiny, fleshless one at that, after 6 big, healthy sons, she seemed an afterthought to her brothers, a last hiccup of fertility from an aging woman, a shrug after the straight-shouldered pride of all that male offspring, a concession to God that they must take the bad with the good. But their beloved mother bent over that bit of flesh as if it were her own heart lying in the rutabaga box, and the Leavitt boys had to go along with it. When the baby was a year old and had become fat and would live, Mother began insisting they remember its name, Rebecca. They worshipped their mother and would obey her slightest wish, and not only because their father would trounce them if they didn't. Mother meant comfort and cooking and clean clothes and a gentle hand on scrapes and blistered feet. Mother meant music and stories and candy pulls and picnics. Still, one could only be so obliging. When she was little, if Rebecca climbed onto the lap of a brother, he would say, "Mother, get this thing off me." But their predilection to ignore her was benign enough, and gradually the child became useful in the way of help for their mother. Now, at 14 years, she had become an excellent baker, could milk a kiki cow, and knit a good sock. This night, the boys at their evening meal, having worked like slaves all day, couldn't get the food down their throats fast enough. They talked amongst themselves about land and stock and their prospects. "Wolves are fat and cheeky for last year's die-out," Gideon said. "Lots of new pups, and mama wolves needing to feed them. I heard Cochrane imported wolfhounds to deal with them." "So he did," Father said, "and the wolves have dealt with the wolfhounds most egregiously." "What does egregiously mean?" Rebecca asked. "I don't suppose a wolf or 2 will stop us," Ammon said with his mouth half full. "It's the Brits and Easterners we have to worry about." "Father, why do we have to worry about Easterners?" Rebecca said. Father said, "The Brits, and I proudly count myself one of them, gave me 160 acres of the finest land on earth. One day my sons will have the same opportunity. We will not speak against the British." "And me," Rebecca said. "One day I will have an opportunity." "Never mind the Easterners," Ammon said. "Our own Westerners are a thorn in the flesh enough. Heard today the editor of the Edmonton Bulletin, one Frank Oliver, says we Mormons are as nasty as Chinamen." "I shall take that as a great compliment," Father said. This Oliver fellow went on to say that we are an utter abomination, I quote, "which no effort should be spared to rid the nation of." "Well," Father said, buttering another piece of bread, "other than ending it unnecessarily with a preposition, I'd say that was fine phrasing. Mr. Oliver appears to be in the right profession." "What's a preposition?" Rebecca asked. Ammon said, Will we make it, Father? Ammon asked this. Ammon, who was as sure as a bull in a field of cows, who never asked a question to which he didn't already know the answer. Ammon, in all meekness, was asking Father if they were going to make it. Furthermore, Father was pondering his question as if he were unsure how to answer. Of course we will make it, Rebecca said. Shame for asking. Of course we will. Her parents and brothers looked at her and frowned as if she were Balaam's donkey or some other low oracle. Father rested his elbows on the table and, folding his hands over his plate, said, I am grateful for your confidence, Rebecca, but what is the source of it? What makes you think you can call shame upon your older brother? Because, she said. Always the best reason, Father said. The best, said Ammon, nodding solemnly. Because, she said less boldly, because I saw God. In her heart, she knew that the two bore no relation, but after all, she had seen God, and shouldn't that lend a little weight to her pronouncements? After an astonished silence, Gideon snorted, and Ammon and Aaron laughed. Mother put down her cutlery, and Father looked at her the way he had when one of his cows got the bloat. And where did you see him, sister? He was on the sitting rock up on the bluff, looking over the flats to the mountains, she said. Silence. It was a pretty evening, she said. The impertinence of seeing God at his leisure, Father said. Rebecca, Mother said, these things are not to be trifled with. I'm not trifling, Rebecca said, knowing she was contradicting her mother and for the moment not caring. And what would God want by appearing to you, Aaron said. Nothing. She stared at her plate. I think it was an accident. Perhaps he forgot to make himself invisible. Forgot, eh? Gideon said. Let's hope he doesn't forget to make the sun come up tomorrow morning. The boys laughed again and went back to eating. Lots of people didn't believe the prophets either, she said sullenly, and nor did they care. That's enough, Rebecca, Father said. Consider the state of your soul, Gideon said, grinning. That night in bed, Rebecca considered the state of her soul. She was a mischief maker, a prank puller by compulsion, and oft-times unlovely of temper. Mother blamed her brothers and their bad influence for that, but she knew it was her own self to blame. On the good side, she was fair and could see the other side of a thing. And also, well, she supposed that was all the goodness she could honestly lay claim to. She suspected she had been born more naturally wicked than other girls, and a lifetime of humble reflection would never make her as good as her sweet friend LaRue already was. She said her prayers lying down, careful to ask for twice as many blessings as she needed, remembering that Ammon had told her you only got half the blessings you asked for if you didn't pray on your knees. Gideon said that was foolishness, but just in case. It occurred to her that nobody yet owned the rocky, hilly land between her father's place and Levi Webster's, the land of the Sitting Rock. Please bless the British and Mr. Frank Oliver, and may this prayer heap coals upon their heads, she added to her prayers. And please bless the wolf pups, and may I please have my own homestead. 2, I mean. She fell asleep, gazing at the shining prairie with a sweet assurance that the wolf pups would eat that night. Okay, so she's 4 years older now. The land agent was one Mr. Caldwell who lived in Fort McLeod and who boasted that he had a high tolerance for Mormons and didn't mind taking their money for land. He had brown teeth, for he was a prodigious tobacco chewer, and the flesh on the inside of his mouth was black. He stood behind a high countertop in the land agent's office. She had come alone with her money. She took it out of the box and laid it in all its glory on the counter. She knew she could buy lumber enough for 3 houses with that money. She could buy 20 pink silk dresses like Rodonna's if she wished. It was a very great deal of money, and her hands, calloused and scarred like an old woman's, proved she had earned every cent. I have heard that it is $3 an acre, Mr. Caldwell, she said, for land down Buffalo Flats way. Yes, miss, it is, Mr. Caldwell said. I would like to buy a quarter section of that land, the place between my father Samuel Leavitt's spread and Levi Webster's. Please. She felt so proud saying those words, and not the good pride either. She noticed just then that she was a little taller than Mr. Caldwell. He spat, missing the spittoon. You can count it, she said generously. He picked up the money and counted it, moving his blackish lips silently. Yes, ma'am, that is $480, all right. Carefully, he put the money back in the box. Miss, he said, unfortunately, I cannot sell you that land. He smiled brownly and folded his hands primly on the counter. Rebecca bent over her money. She knew every bill, every coin. She must have misunderstood. You can sell me the land? No, miss, cannot. She waited for him to continue, but he just looked at her silently with his tobacco-stained eyes and leaned his elbows on the counter. Is there something wrong with my money? No, miss, nothing is wrong with your money. This here is good money, okay, but I can't take it because I can't give you land for it. Why? If Mother had been standing near, she may have cautioned Rebecca to modulate her voice. She stood a little taller and began to speak. He stood a little taller and began to speak as if he were doing a school recitation. In 1872, the Dominion Lands Act said land was open to males over the age of 21. 21, she said. In 1874, the age limit was lowered to 18, males over the age of 18. She breathed out with relief. 18, thank goodness. But then, notice, miss, that I said males over 18. Males, but... Now, in 1876, the Act changed once again to allow women over the age of 18, provided she is the sole head of a family. Provided she is... What does that mean? You are not the head of a family. No, sir, I am the tail end. Yes, I know your father. But Mrs. Bedingfeld in Pakisco, she is a widow with a son, making her the sole head of her family. He punctuated these last words by tapping his dry yellow finger on the counter, one tap for each word. Are you saying that because I am an unmarried woman, I am not allowed to own my own land? I am saying that. She could not take her eyes away from the black lining of his lips. But how is this fair, she asked. How can it be right? It needn't be fair or right, miss, because it is the law. There's a difference between what is right and what is legal, and fair doesn't enter into things at all. Under the law, you are a person in matter of pains and penalties, but not in matters of rights and privileges. Pains and what? Penalties. Are you saying, Mr. Caldwell, that I cannot buy land because I am not a person? You understand, he said, if a big old buffalo wandered by with $480 pinned to his horns, I couldn't sell him that land. Rebecca studied the counter between her and the land agent. She was pretty sure at that moment she could leap over it and take down that land agent. But that counter, it had the whole government and even the Mounties behind it. A counter like that was not to be leaped over or contradicted. She touched her money. Not a person. The government said so. All her work, the hours of extra milking, the days of cooking on the canal for dozens of men in the heat, and the flies and the mosquitoes, the endless making of straw hats and the doing of double chores for Mrs. Praxham, the selling of her spare-bodied cows. None of that made her a person. She felt the pains and penalties of all that work, but it gave her neither rights nor privileges. She picked up her money box slowly as if it were full of gold. The coins and paper money had the Queen's picture on it. Was the Queen a person? But then she was a widow and a mother of many children. I thank you for your time, Mr. Caldwell, she said. Never had the exercise of her good manners cost her so much. "My pleasure, miss," he said, running his hands over his counter. Rebecca managed somehow to get herself into the carriage and headed toward home. The clouds hung in tatters, so low she felt she could touch them if she stood up on the carriage. Not a person. Mr. Caldwell and all of the Dominion said so. The clouds obscured the mountains. She couldn't see them even if she were to go to her sitting rock, which would never be her sitting rock now. It would belong to someone else. Mother was scalding jars for pickling when Rebecca walked in, carrying her box full of money. "Well, Rebecca, is it done?" Mother stood and smiled and removed her apron. "It is not, Mother." "Is something wrong? Did you get your deed?" Rebecca shook her head. "Only persons can buy land, Mother." "What are you talking about?" "Only persons can buy land, and I am not a person. The Dominion of Canada says so, and so does Mr. Caldwell and the Mounties and the Queen. The land agent told me, in no way can I own property unless I am the sole head of a family, which I am not." "Surely you've misunderstood," Mother said. "Homesteading, yes, but you have cash money." "I'm feeling a little tired, Mother. I think I'll lie down." After a moment, Mother followed her into her tiny bedroom. "Will you lie down, Rebecca?" "Yes, Mother." She removed her bonnet and hung it on the nail that was just for bonnets. Her brother's hats lived on the points of the elk head's antlers in the main room. "And will you lie down?" There was something in her mother's voice that Rebecca had never heard before. "Mother, you must have that land." "Mother, that counter, it is not to be defied." "Of course you are a person," Mother said. "You live and breathe. You have parts." So does a big old buffalo." "You are the daughter of Samuel Leavitt," Mother said, as if that were the solution to every problem. Rebecca sat on her bed, which thing she had never done before, in the middle of the day. "Now I know why Father and my brothers laughed when I told them my plan, and now I am seeing that Mr. Caldwell was right, for I am feeling the pain of being born a girl." "Well," Mother said, slowly putting her apron back on, "the laughing will stop now, for I have watched you work and save, and you will have that section of land." "But do not speak of counters to me, Sarah. To me, Rebecca. Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel had their say too, and a daughter might have what a woman cannot." That afternoon she and Mother outdid themselves in their preparations for the evening meal. Most nights they served venison or prairie chickens so they might have the beef for selling and the chickens for eggs. But tonight they had a ham and deviled eggs and potatoes mashed with fresh warm cream and a whole jar of pickled beets and hot just out of the oven dinner rolls with butter baked into their hearts, and gooseberry pie and whipped cream for dessert. "Is there company?" Ammon asked, looking at the ham glistening in a glaze of brown sugar. "No, son," Mother said, in the hearing of her husband. "It is an Easter feast, a meal to soften the heart." "Well, my heart is soft as summer butter already," Father said. Mother prayed the blessing, which was full of gratitude for her husband, who exercised his priesthood with persuasion, long-suffering, gentleness, meekness, and love unfeigned. Father was blushing by the time his wife said amen. He began filling his plate with the steaming potatoes while Ammon carved the ham. "Today, Samuel, was a special day," Mother said. "Rebecca took herself to the land agent, and what do you suppose transpired there?" Father stopped heaping his potatoes, the serving spoon poised in the air above his plate. He looked at his wife, at Rebecca, at his sons, back at his wife again. Slowly he let the serving spoon drop back into the pot. Rebecca saw that her brothers were concentrating on their mashed potatoes as if a gold coin were hidden in it. Perhaps you know, husband, what transpired, Mother said, in a voice that was like a mild breeze on a glacier field. Perhaps you have already guessed. Rebecca, why don't you tell us what happened at the land agent's office? Rebecca could not decide if she was relieved that her mother had taken up in her defense, or if she was terrified by this woman she had never seen before, so cool, so powerfully armed by her previous 40 years of devotion to her husband, so straight of back and high of chin. Father, I was told that I could not buy land because I am not a person by virtue of having been born a girl. Father said nothing for a long moment. Mother's gaze swung in dignified containment from Rebecca to her husband, the way a heavy carved church door swings solemnly on its hinges. Father cleared his throat, and everyone waited for him to say something, but he did not. Ammon said, "Excuse me from the table, please." "No," Mother said, "you are not excused. Did you know Samuel, her own father, and you boys, her own brothers, did you know as she slaved and sweated and saved that this would happen? And did you laugh?" Rebecca knew that Leavitts were never afraid. She knew they did not give way or give up or back down, but right now they were all afraid. In her wicked heart, she was equally afraid for losing the land she had set her heart on. Father said, "I have been aware of the Land Act at one time or another." Rebecca's brothers looked down at their plates, apparently not presuming upon their right to seconds. They sat hunched and hoping to be forgotten. Nobody knew better than Rebecca the satisfaction of playing a good joke on someone most deserving, but it was a new feeling to her to be the deserving one, to be the one who was being laughed at. Mother looked on her husbands and sons as if she were considering the method of their execution. "Liza," Father said, "Rebecca will still have that money, and when she marries she can give it to her husband, and together they—" Mother spoke over him, which things she had never done before. "Rebecca and I have prayed, and we have devised a solution to the problem. Rebecca?" Mother put a teaspoon of peas on her plate, daintily, as if the problem would go away now that Rebecca was presenting the solution. Father and her brothers visibly relaxed, and Ammon dared to take another piece of ham. Rebecca made her voice as meek and humble as she knew how. "I was told that a woman who is sole head of a family may buy property, as did the widow Mrs. Bedingfeld. Since I have no marriage prospects, and even if I did, I might have to wait a long time for my husband's demise, at which point I may not welcome it. I must become head of another family." She glanced at Mother, who nodded deeply. "This family, for example." Father and her brothers unhunched their shoulders and unbent their heads. Father brightened and slapped his thigh. "Ha!" Her brothers grinned. "Ha!" Father slapped his thigh even harder. "I see. This is one of Rebecca's pranks." Rebecca thought she had never seen him so relieved. "No, Father, not a prank," Rebecca said. "There seems to be no other solution for it, and I have prayed earnestly for wisdom, and we know that it is given liberally and without upbraiding." Mother said, "She can represent you and our sons at the next meeting, the one about the oil mining claims. It will only be for as long as it takes to buy the land, and then, Samuel, you will have your rightful place again." Father stared. Her brothers looked warily between Father and Mother. "I'm glad that is settled," Mother said, lifting 3 peas upon a fork to her mouth. Father stood up suddenly. The chair, pushed back by his rising, made an angry sound. "Nothing at all is settled. This is absurd." Mother also stood up, elegantly, genteelly, her chair making not a sound. "The law is the law," Father said in his Sunday preaching voice, "and might I remind you, wife, that we believe in upholding the law. Rebecca, you will one day marry, and at that time you can turn your money over to your husband, and he will buy your land for you." Mother said, soft as snow, in Utah, women have the franchise. We live under British rule, Father said. Mother's head shook just a little and did not stop shaking. Proverbs 31, she said, in which a woman buys a field. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 5, Father said. Surely Father had won, for Rebecca knew that Timothy beat out Proverbs any day. Everything would go back to normal now, but she would not have her land. She drew praying hands to her lips. And this is what you have to say to me, Mother said quietly to her husband. That is what I have to say to you, Father replied. Soon after, without doing the dishes first, Mother moved herself, her quilt, and her rocking chair into the barn. Thank you. So I guess I'm supposed to take questions, if you have any. Yes, sir.
So I read Couture and Lord Death and loved it, and I don't want to spoil it for anyone, so to ask somewhat vaguely. Couture has to make the choice between two love interests, and it's one of the only stories that I've seen where that choice wasn't obvious, neither in what she should do or what I thought she was going to do. And so I wanted to know, how do you maintain that kind of conflict throughout the novel, and at what point did you decide what she was going to do?
Okay, the question is about Couture and Lord Death, and he wondered, he was surprised by the ending. I've had people who said the opposite, said, what? That was so inevitable. I knew it was going to be that way from the start. And other people who were completely betrayed by the ending and couldn't imagine how I could have done that. But he's asking how I maintained, for him at least, and hopefully for other people, that sense of not knowing how it was going to end. And how I did that was not knowing myself how it was going to end until probably a couple of chapters before the end of the book, and in a first draft. And that was, I was just as surprised. But then, of course, then you go back and you make it feel more inevitable after you've done that. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely.
Okay. Yes.
What important differences have you noticed between writing male and female characters? Because you have done both.
Yeah.
Have you noticed any significant differences between those writing those?
That's a really good question. I think if I look carefully, my creatures, this is why I write and don't talk. My male characters, so she's asking me about, do I notice a difference between writing female characters and male characters? And I think that you'll notice that my male characters tend to, those stories tend to be funny. They tend to emphasize humor a lot more. And I think I'm hiding behind that a little bit because, I think maybe I do that. I have 3 daughters and 4 sons, and maybe I feel bilingual in male and female characters. That might be part of it too. I'm sorry, that's just about as intelligent as I can be on that question, but I'll put more thought into that. Yes.
How did you get the inspiration for writing Calvin, the book about the
Okay.
Yeah.
So it has kind of a longish story. I hope it's not boring. I wrote a draft of Tom Finder, which was published in 2001, I think. And it took me a while to figure out that I was writing about a homeless boy. When I did, I did a tremendous amount of research on homelessness and sort of put myself into a bit of a depression over it. I just felt like I had a little black cloud over my head for a long time. And I wrote Tom Finder, and the little black cloud didn't go away. So I wrote Hex Superhero, also about a street kid, and it still didn't quite go away. And I knew that I would one day write a story about homelessness in for girls, and of course you can't really write honestly about that without addressing the topic of prostitution. So that's how my book of Life by Angel came out. And I had felt, I kind of patted myself on the back one day because accidentally I had written 3 different books, all addressing different reasons is not the right word, but maybe some of the reasons for homelessness in young people. So Tom Finder was about abuse and throwaway kids, and Hex Superhero was about poverty, and my book of Life by Angel was about addiction. And I knew that there was another big reason for homelessness in young people, and that was mental illness. So I had it in my mind for a long time that I would write someday about a young character struggling with mental illness. And but I needed a story. A topic isn't a story. And I didn't have a story for it. So it just sat in the back of my brain, one little neuron throbbing away, saying someday you'll write about mental illness. And then one day I was reading Calvin and Hobbes, which I do cyclically. I have all the books, and when I need to be happy, I read Calvin and Hobbes. And one day I was reading and I thought, a psychologist nowadays would probably diagnose Calvin as being a maladaptive daydreamer or possibly even schizophrenic. And that was that one little neuron that thought that made this huge electrical connection with this one little neuron back here. And I felt that I had the beginnings of my story. So what was the question again? I told you it was a long story. What inspired me? So I knew that Calvin was going to be part of that story, and then it took me a while longer. Sometimes as writers, you have to percolate a story for a very long time. So this story that I'm working on now, I read the collection of the Leavitt histories years and years ago. Well, when I first married my husband, so that was a long time ago. And I knew that one day I was going to write a book inspired by how these stories made me feel. And you just wait a long, long time until one day maybe you hear a voice, or you just have an entry. There's some entry into the story, and there's a certain amount of patience involved, isn't there, in waiting for that moment where you have some of the elements. And then you slave away blindly, not having a clue what you're doing, and yeah. Yes.
So when I was looking at like the list of books that you've written and like the various genres that you've done, as well as like the huge list of awards that you've won, I was really interested because a lot of the times it seems that like these big literary awards, they don't notice young adult books, especially genre books like fantasy or historical or anything like that. Do you have any idea why it is that, what it is about your books that have managed to convince people to look at them?
Oh, she's wondering what it is about my books that have had managed to interest people on awards committees in particular. Is that your question? So, God. If you don't make money, prizes are a nice consolation prize. Of course, all the award attention I've had has been specifically for young adult literature. So although one of my books did accidentally get shortlisted for an adult prize. I was completely humiliated because it just didn't fit. One of these things is not like the other. But why do they? I don't know. Let me tell you the story instead about the National Book Award. So I was making turkey dinner. It was Canadian Thanksgiving in October. And the dinner, you know, it's like a production, right? Everything has to come out right at the same time. And I was worried about my turkey, if it was going to be done at the same time. So I'm very, very concentrating very much on this meal, and all my family is coming. And I get a phone call, and I pick up the phone, and I'm crooking it in my ear while I pull the turkey out of the oven. And this nice man says, "I'm calling to tell you that you've been shortlisted for the National Book Award." Now, I'm Canadian, and I also live in a bit of a bubble. I had no idea what the National Book Award was. And I said, "Oh, lovely," because, you know, I get nominated for lots of little awards that don't, you know, aren't really on anybody's radar. And I said, "Oh, that's lovely. Thank you for letting me know." And he said, I'm sure he was very taken aback. He said, "So we'll make arrangements for you to come to New York City to do readings and for the ceremony." And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't do public readings." And he said, "Well, your editor has signed a contract and you have to come to New York City to do a reading." And I said, "Well, you know, New York City sounds nice. I've never been there." And he hung up. The disgust was evident by the end of the phone call. And so then I went to my computer and Googled National Book Award and went, "Oh, wow, this might be life-changing, actually." And so that was pretty cool. But I have to tell you that there are many days when I wish I could go back to the me that didn't know anything about the National Book Award. And I'll tell you why. Because right after that happened, before that, I wrote my stories completely oblivious to if anybody was reading them at all. And based on my royalty checks, very few people were reading them anyway. And suddenly after that, there was somebody over my shoulder. There's a reason that there's 6 years between my National Book Award and my next book. 6 years between the two. For a long time, it took me a long time to get back to the real reason for writing. And, you know, so that's my parable. That's my little... Am I done? Is it time up? Okay. Thank you so much.